The spread of COVID-19 has caused so much confusion and fear, so I thought that now would be the perfect time to discuss a more positive angle about the state of people in general. Hi, this is Bradley and you're listening to Psych Everywhere. In this special episode, you'll get to listen to a little-known psychologist named Steven Pinker. Okay, I know, that's definitely a bad joke on my part. I mean, if you Google most popular or most prominent living psychologist, boom, there's Steven Pinker's name and photo, and it's right there alongside other psychology legends, like Paul Ekman, Susan Blackmore, and Philip Zimbardo. So I nervously picked up the phone to call Dr. Pinker for this interview, and I gotta admit I was feeling a lot more nervous than usual. I had just double-checked the recording equipment and I had just reread my notes for the call like 4 times or something right before I dialed. And so I pressed the numbers and the line started ringing. Nothing to worry about, right? I mean, I'm just calling for a quick chat with one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world. And so it's ringing and I've got this death grip on the phone and Time's going weirdly slow, and then he finally answered. Okay, it was probably just 3 rings, but anyway, he said, "This is Dr. Pinker," and so I said hello in my name, or I said something that sounded sort of like it, I hope, and then he said, very politely, "I need just a few minutes to finish something up. Could I call you back in 10 minutes? See, I told you that it'd be a short call, so of course I said okay, and we both hung up, and then there I sat for another 10 minutes, right next to the phone, knowing that Steven Pinker might give me a call at any moment. So before we get to the interview, allow me to go ahead and tell you, real quick, about the legendary Dr. Steven Pinker. You've almost definitely heard of Dr. Pinker, but here's his latest biography statement. Steven Pinker is an experimental psychologist who conducts research in visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations. He grew up in Montreal and earned his BA from McGill and his PhD from Harvard. Currently Johnstone Professor of Psychology at Harvard, he is also taught at Stanford and MIT. Dr. Pinker has won many prizes for his research, teaching, and 10 books, which include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank State, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and The Sense of Style. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Humanist of the Year, a recipient of 9 honorary doctorates, and one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world today. His latest book is Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. It is the contents of that latest book that we'll be discussing today. The basic idea is to let people know that the world isn't really falling apart like the media indicates. Instead, Dr. Pinker encourages you to look away from all the gloomy headlines and the end of times prophecies, and instead to follow the data. People around the world are generally happier and live longer than ever before. And there's also less poverty and fewer deaths by war than in the past. The book discusses many other stats as well. This topic is naturally somewhat controversial. People seem to either love it or they hate it. And so, although Bill Gates has called Enlightenment Now his new favorite book of all time, many others reject some of the ideas presented altogether, some seeing it as Trump bashing, and others seeing it as a slippery slope that, if presented too often, could cause people to overlook numerous problems faced today. In just a moment, Dr. Pinker and I are going to discuss these points of view. And of course, I'm going to give him some opportunity to present his argument. But first, there is one last thing that I'd like to let you know. Because I knew this would be a controversial conversation, I started the interview with a very positive, easy question, which I hoped would sort of, build up a little trust between us, so that when we got to those other questions, we could hopefully continue to have that friendly and hopefully meaningful conversation. That being said, From the moment that he began to answer that first question, Dr. Pinker immediately acknowledged and addressed the naysayers of his book. I really appreciated this frankness, and so I wanted to point that out. Okay, the phone is now ringing, and on the other end of the line is Dr. Steven Pinker, so let's hear what he has to say. Why do you think so many people agree so strongly with your view that people are better off now than ever before?
I don't know that people agree with it. In fact, a vast number of people disagree with it. They find it either incredible or offensive. The evidence for it just consists of numbers on human well-being. The fact that life expectancy has gone from about 30 to more than 70 worldwide and more than 80 in developed countries. That literacy has gone from maybe 10% of the population worldwide to 90%, at least among people under the age of 25. That extreme poverty has declined from 90% of the world's population to about 8%, that the rate of death in war has fallen from about 20 per 100,000 per year in the late 1940s to 1 per 100,000 per year today. The fact that the homicide rate has fallen over time from maybe 20 or 30 per 100,000 per year to 1 to 2, depending on the country. The fact that overall happiness has increased in a majority of countries for which we have longitudinal data. So in measure after measure, we are better off, but most people deny it. Most people think that life is getting worse, partly because of the availability bias that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman documented long ago, where people get their view of the world from anecdotes and narratives and images, and the news will always present us with wars and shootings and famines and now epidemics. Partly because people's own built-in nostalgia, we tend to forget how bad past times were while we were living through them. And partly it's because of social competition. To criticize the present is a way of criticizing your contemporaries, your rivals, the other elites. And so there's always a niche for critics. People who point to improvement are often considered to be apologizing for the status quo. So the fact is we've gotten better, and the fact is that most people are unaware of it or deny it.
Well, here's a couple short answer ones. So just to be clear, you're saying that people are better off, though, right? You're not saying they're perfect.
Exactly. That's quite right, and that's a common confusion. People say, well, what about all the poverty that's around? What about the war in Syria and Yemen and South Sudan? And indeed, those are horrible. 8% of the world in extreme poverty is hundreds of millions of people, which is far too many. And my response is that better does not mean perfect. A decline does not mean a disappearance, and that we should look at the past successes as emboldening us to continue the progress, to try to bring poverty down to as close to zero as we can, and war and illiteracy.
Okay, and when you say better than when, how far back are we talking?
Depends on the measure, and these improvements unfolded on different time scales. So the decline of war really is a post-World War II phenomenon. Before that, there was really not much of a trend in war deaths. A lot of fluctuation, but no overall trend until 1945. Poverty, probably beginning with the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century. Life expectancy really started to take off with the public health revolution at the second half of the 19th century, with sanitation and cleanliness of drinking water. I consider the Enlightenment to be a kind of a turning point, not for every measure, but that is when our modern concepts of democracy, of wealth creation through trade and commerce, of the benefits of international organizations, of the expansion of education, of greater regard for human rights, all kind of kicked into gear.
Do you think that taking a positive view on this, the state of human society, could maybe cause us to let our guard down, sort of, on current potential problems?
No, I think obviously we have to be accurate in our assessment of the world. We have to recognize the threats that exist and acknowledge their severity. We have to be aware of the suffering and injustice that continues to exist. But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that no progress has taken place, because that can lead to a kind of fatalism and helplessness, where one might say, well, if decades or centuries of trying to make the world a better place have led to nothing, why even bother? We should just enjoy ourselves while we can. Trying to improve human life is utopian or romantic or idealistic. Or it can lead to radicalism, that everything is failing, we should just tear the whole system down and hope that whatever rises out of the ashes is better than what we have now. And we know from history that can itself lead to atrocities and catastrophes.
Well, obviously, controversy sells and negative emotion sells. So, what incentive does the media? What do they have? What reason to be more positive?
People are increasingly avoiding the news because it puts them into such a foul mood. They get anxious, they get depressed, they feel hopeless, they undergo learned helplessness. So there is, and of course, people are turning away from mainstream media in droves, particularly newspapers. So even though violence sells, it sells in our fictional entertainment and it sells in our news, people are kind of gruesomely captivated by threats and disasters and fears. But that can reach a point of diminishing returns where people avoid the news altogether. In any case, I think most journalists have, together with the desire to sell papers, or nowadays to sell clicks and eyeballs, there is an altruistic responsibility. I think most people in journalism feel that they're not just, certainly not in it to make a buck, because journalism would not be the most lucrative career choice, but they do feel that they have a responsibility to inform the world, and that good things come from that. And among them is giving, I think ought to be, presenting an accurate picture of progress where it has taken place, of successful reforms, of advances in rights and well-being. The better we can isolate what caused those improvements and seek to carry them forward.
Okay. Can you think of any examples of organizations or, I don't know, countries or political campaign that promoted a positive big picture message and was successful?
Oh, sure. Well, I think the United Nations, for all its follies and all of its ludicrous theater and posturing in the General Assembly, just by setting up a norm that war is not a legitimate way for nations to settle their disputes, and that nation states are immortal. They may no longer be conquered. Territory can no longer be acquired as a way of settling disputes. That serves some of the credit for the decline of war since 1945. The foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation that sponsored the research leading to the Green Revolution from Norman Borlaug, it's been credited with saving 1 billion lives. Movements like, often a federation of organizations, but the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, the Gay Rights Movement, all of which have attained real progress. The attempts to reduce child labor and child exploitation, led by Kailash Satyarthi, who won the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize. There are data that there really are fewer kids being exploited in labor and trafficking. So there are lots of organizations that have achieved incremental successes. Within countries, programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, the Earned Income Tax Credit have reduced poverty when measured net of government benefits. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency have reduced the amount of air and water pollution within the United States. The Montreal Protocol to eliminate the emission of chlorofluorocarbons has led to the elimination of the ozone hole. Lots of examples.
So you just gave all these examples of longitudinal data, and I think that's really cool. So how on earth did you go about choosing which items to examine?
Well, I began with violence because as a psychologist, I had written about our violent impulses in The Blank Slate, and I wanted to note that they don't doom us to perpetual warfare and conflict, noting that there had been reductions, and as I became aware of more and more data sets showing declines in violence, that became the basis of its own book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. From there, I was exposed to data sets on other dimensions of human flourishing. I picked them not because they were the ones that showed improvements, but just because they were the basic dimensions of human well-being. Life, prosperity, and education being the top three, but safety from violence and from natural accidents being others. Options to enjoy cultural and natural richness. And, of course, self-rated happiness or life satisfaction being the ultimate criterion.
So, The Better Angels, you published that back in 2011, I believe. So you've been working on this topic for a while. Have your views about like the decrease of violence changed any, or on any of these topics in the last 10 years?
Well, I probably had a more sanguine view of the spread of liberal, international, cosmopolitan values than I do now. I did not anticipate the rise of Donald Trump and authoritarian populism. I thought they were on their way out, and they clearly are not. I do think that they are not the wave of the future, but they certainly are in a kind of second wind.
Well, I wasn't really going to do too much with politics. I've actually seen in some past interviews where you kind of steered clear from it a bit, but I kind of wondered, so in President Trump's first campaign, it was Make America Great Again. It pretty much directly inferred that things were worse now than they used to be. Whereas now, his platform is Keep America Great, which is more in line with what you're saying. So I wondered, like, over the years that you've been doing this, have you seen a shift in who the kind of people are who are willing to accept this idea?
There's a natural tendency for incumbents to want to say that things are going great, and for challengers to deplore declines. And most academics are challengers in the sense that they don't run things, they're not responsible for delivering clean water through the pipes, so it's kind of easy to snipe at the status quo if you're not in charge of getting things to run. And yes, you have seen the flip in Trump. The Make America Great Again runs very much against the kind of humanism and secular cosmopolitanism that I advocated in both books, both because it's reactionary in the sense that it looks backwards to a golden age instead of forwards to improvement, and because it defines the nation, the group, as the unit of well-being. It's Make America Great Again, not make people better off.
So your position is sort of that people are better off today. I feel like I've said that a bunch. But what about tomorrow, or 5 years down the road, or what about even 1,000 years? Like, how far does sort of your prediction go?
Certainly not 1,000 years, and I'm not even so sure that it's a prediction so much as it is an attempt to identify what's responsible for improvement. The subtitle of Enlightenment Now was The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. The progress, I argue, being the result of reason, science, and humanism. So the prediction is only to the extent that our collective norms and our institutions are dedicated to reason, science, and humanism, progress can continue. Not guaranteed, because there can be rude shocks like a pandemic or climate change if we don't deal with it successfully. But if we abandon the ideals of reason, science, and humanism, then we may not see progress, because progress is not a force of nature. It doesn't happen by itself. It's certainly not something that we can expect to happen all by itself. It happens only to the extent that we dedicate ourselves to these ideals.
Thanks. I actually appreciate you kind of clarifying that and stepping me back a little bit. So you mentioned climate change, and I wanted to talk about this too. I've had to be so careful to say people are better off today, but I was wondering, what about animals in our environment?
Probably not better off, although, I mean, animals in a natural environment don't have it so great. They starve, they get eaten, they get sick, and I don't think we have a good measure of the well-being of animals in the natural world. There may be fewer of them, depending on the species, but that may reflect the change in population size and number of offspring, not necessarily suffering. Certainly, it hasn't gotten better for farm animals in terms of the sheer number of them, and that is something of which there's increasing awareness, and then one could argue that's another frontier of progress that we ought to push forward.
Okay. Could I get one more question?
Okay, one more.
Okay. I wanted to ask, why does all this matter? Like, what is there to gain from having a more accurate view of society?
There's very much to be gained in having a more accurate view of anything, namely that our decisions are much more likely to bring about what we want. And so if we want to be more prosperous, happier, healthier, better educated, more satisfied with our lives, if we want to reduce poverty and disease and violence elsewhere, we've got to understand what drives them up and down. The better that we isolate the forces that drive them down and implement more of them.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Psych Everywhere. This podcast is brought to you by Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. I have to admit that I really liked the idea that people would benefit from having a more positive view of the world. In the end, whether you agree or disagree, I think this episode should have provided you with some very interesting things to think about. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find a shorter written version in the latest issue of Ion Psychi magazine. Just visit www.psi.org/I_main_244. Due to COVID-19, there won't be any Psychi regional conventions this spring. Also, the APS convention in May, which Psi Chi also regularly attends, has been canceled too. However, like I've said before, I'm still looking forward to interviewing Psi Chi's distinguished lecturers. So far, you've heard from Drs. Ira Hyman and now Steven Pinker, so stay tuned for more episodes from our distinguished lecturers. Coming up next, we've got a really interesting interview between Drs. Regan A.R. Goering and Carolyn Brown Kramer. They're going to be talking about conducting effective group work, and that's something that affects all of us whether we're students or professors in school or out. Okay, that's all for now. Stay safe out there. I'll talk to you again soon. Copyright 2020. Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.